Today I'm at the Mission Dolores State Historic Site in San Augustine, Texas. I'm going to be interviewing a gentleman by the name of Jameson Moore, who is the Director of Education for the site. We're going to be talking about the history of the mission and the preservation that was involved in this site. Due to COVID-19 protocols, we will be wearing masks during the interview portion of the video. Just wanted to make sure that that was clear on why we were doing that, and you won't be able to see our faces for the rest of the video. Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about Mission Dolores and the important work that's being done at this site and that's been done at this site in order to preserve it for visitors to come and learn more about the history of this mission as well as the Spanish missions of Texas. Joining with me is Jameson Moore, and he's going to be helping us to understand more about the mission site. Jameson, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. So my first question is, could you tell us a little bit about why the Spanish missions are an important part of Texas's history?
Sure. A lot of us focus, and I think it's good to focus on kind of the Texas Revolution and Texas's independence from Mexico, and then the Republic of Texas, and cattle drives, and all of that sort of stuff, which most people associate most strongly with Texas and Texas history. A lot of that comes from all of the different, mostly Anglo groups who moved into Texas in the 1830s and 40s, really built a lot of the political structures that we would recognize today. And a lot of people who first got interested in Texas history may have become interested because of relatives who came in during this time period and set up many of these institutions. Spanish Texas is much older than the Republic of Texas or Anglo involvement in Texas. And so Spanish Texas lays a lot of the groundwork and foundation for many of the laws that become established here. A lot of people don't realize that still in Texas today, official land measurements are taken on the Spanish vara system, which is entirely Spanish. It's not an Anglo or an English or an American system of measuring or surveying land. And the Spanish ruled Texas for about 300 years. So that's longer than even the United States has been involved in Texas. And so to forget Spanish history is to forget really the foundation of how Texas becomes established and why some of the earliest Americans were interested in moving to Texas in the first place.
All right, cool. So could you tell us a little bit about this specific site, Mission Dolores, and what role did it play in the history of missions and Texas?
Sure. So during the early colonial period, there were a number of expeditions that went through Texas by the Spanish, mostly seeking gold and reasons to establish permanent Spanish government here in the area. A lot of the early Spanish who came through had heard about tales of the Aztec and Inca empires down in Mexico and Central and South America. And so there's a thought that there must be something in North America that has some sort of similar, large, wealthy, established political entity that the Spanish can ally themselves or conquer and bring wealth and glory to Spain. These expeditions are largely unsuccessful, but they do pique interest of certain groups in Texas and other regions of North America, notably Franciscan missionaries. Franciscan missionaries hear about some of the native groups in this area, particularly the Caddo here at this site. And there's this idea that by bringing the Franciscan religion to them, the Roman Catholic religion, if this Caddo, this powerful tribe, converts, they'll be a great influence in converting other native groups in the area because of their strong political system of government, and their power in this region. They're a central and large native nation state in a lot of ways. And so the Franciscans are very, very interested in this area, and they're working for a long time to establish missions to convert native peoples. They really believe that these native peoples are in serious danger of damnation, of being rejected by God if they do not convert to Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism. So there's a great desire to bring missionaries here and convert these people. Now, the Spanish government, some people in the Spanish government are interested in that, but that's not a priority for most of Spanish government. The Spanish government is mostly concerned with rule, power, their coffers, their money, that sort of thing. And so there's originally not as much support from the Spanish until they realized the French might be pushing into this area which the Spanish had already claimed. At that point, they make a deal with the Franciscans and say, we'll fund your missions, and you can come out here and set up your missions and try to convert these native peoples, and we'll make sure that you have the funding and the resources you need to do that, but you also have to make sure that the French aren't coming into our land and act as kind of a buffer to this French movement. And so that's why this mission is established. It's built in originally 1717. It moves to this site in 1721. And that's all from several years of fallout from the La Salle expedition, the French first moving into this area, and the Spanish trying to check that movement.
Right.
This mission is going to end up closing because the French will cede or transfer Louisiana over to the Spanish, and there's no longer that need to keep an eye on French involvement. And so the Spanish aren't going to be interested in funding this mission anymore. So in 1773, this mission closes. So it runs for about 50 years, but depending on who you ask, if you ask the Franciscans, they're here to convert native peoples and bring the gospel to East Texas. If you talk to the Spanish government officials, they're here to make sure that the French don't push into Texas.
So one of the questions that I'm very curious about, I know that this site would have been a wooden structure, correct?
Yes, sir. We believe it would have been largely wood frame structures with vertical wooden posts, and then substances kind of like adobe, but more suited to an East Texas environment. That's mud and plasters that are pushed up against these wooden frames to insulate and seal in these structures.
So with it being primarily a wooden structure, unlike a lot of the stone structures out in San Antonio that are still there today, what work was done to identify this site as being the actual site of Mission Dolores?
That's a great question. So none of the East Texas missions have survived to the present day. They were all wooden structures, and some of them may have rotted away. The wood, which is already cut and milled correctly, it's a lot of work if you're doing it all by hand. So after these missions are abandoned, it's likely that either natives or other settlers who are moving into this area are repurposing the wood for other structures, and so taking the wood that way. So none of the original structures remain. We know through a variety of ways. So there are maps from the period that identify where these missions are. And then you kind of triangulate that with other accounts of people describing where these missions are. There's a collective memory from people who moved into the area within a few years after this mission closing, saying where this mission is, and that gets passed down fairly reliably through the generations. The man who buys this property in the early 19th century buys it because he knows that the mission was here originally. And he's interested in, there's tales that there may have been gold buried here and things like that. And so, but also he's interested in kind of the historic value of that. And then you take all of those pieces of information and then you triangulate that with archaeology, where you do excavations, and depending on what you find and what you're looking for, you piece those pieces together and paint a fuller picture. So archaeological investigations in this area revealed early Spanish pottery, French pottery, and pottery that originated in China, which would have been trading through the French and Spanish. all from the time period of the mission. So all very much predating later Anglo settlements. So we know it's not part of the Texas Revolution or anything like that. When those pottery sherds were discovered, more archaeological investigation was done, and we were able to find remains from post holes, and we were able to plot out where the different pieces and foundation of the mission buildings would have been, and we were able to kind of reconstruct what the mission would have looked like through imaging that way.
It's really cool. So once you guys kind of had those things in place, what work was done to preserve this site for historical preservation?
Yeah, so a number of archaeological investigations occur in the 20th century. Really in kind of the end of the 20th century, a lot of work is done. And San Augustine, the town here, purchases this site and decides to build a museum here in order to keep the memory of this site alive. Unfortunately, by the time that happened, the highway had already been built much earlier in the century and plowed right through where the original mission would have been. Now, we have found the remains of the mission on either side, so we know it straddled the highway, but unfortunately, much of the evidence has been lost by the building of that highway right there. And so San Augustine wanted to make sure that that wasn't going to happen anymore, and so they preserved this site. And then just a few years ago, the Texas Historical Commission, which is a government organization in the state of Texas dedicated to preserving historic sites, took this site from, was given this site from the city. So they didn't just come in and take it. The city gave it to the Texas Historical Commission, and since then we've been working on redoing the museum and preserving the site, and then also interpreting the site. And that's where you take people who do a lot of research and do a lot of work trying to figure out what life was like here, what the mission would have looked like. Every question that you might think some visitor would have about this mission, we work on trying to find those answers. And then when visitors come through, or in order to get visitors to come through, we put on programming and explain to people what life would have been like here.
Great. Well, one final question for you. Now that THC does have the site, are there any plans to revitalize it, or what's being done for the future of the mission to continue attracting those visitors?
Sure. So we're entirely redoing our museum currently, and this new exhibit, which will be opening in probably the early summer or the late spring of 2021. We haven't figured out the specific opening date yet, but right in kind of that time period, we're going to be opening the main exhibit. And that main exhibit is going to walk through the entire history of Mission Dolores, how it was set up, why it was set up, kind of everything that we've gone through today in more detail, showing the archaeological finds we've had, reconstructions of different pieces, what they would have looked like in the period, so you can see originals next to reproductions, and you can get an idea of what physical life was like here and why people were willing to risk so much to move out here in the 18th century. So that exhibit is going to be going on display, and that will be essentially a permanent fixture. We don't intend on changing in any major way that specific exhibit for another 7 to 10 years. It's going to be kind of a long-term exhibit. And then as we build more evidence and learn more things, or if we have to change the way we think about certain things in light of new evidence, we'll look at that point in updating the museum. We also have, on this side of the museum, temporary and rotating exhibits that we've periodically put through, which run from 3 months to a year. And they focus on usually stories that you're not going to get kind of from the main exhibit. So tangential stories that are related to the history of this site, and that flesh out the story more, give more background, or connect this story to other stories people would be familiar with. And the idea of that is not only to explain, well, like the museum, the history of this area to visitors, but also to keep attracting people to come back and learn more and be invested in this site and connect themselves to this site. Because it's so easy, once you've seen one museum, to kind of move on and kind of forget that it's there. But interpretation is an ongoing thing, and all of our programming and updating of exhibits is meant to keep people interested, invested, and wanting to tell the story themselves, equipping the people of Texas to be able to remember and preserve other important parts of their history that are sometimes forgotten.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you guys are doing some amazing work. It sounds like it's still an active historical site.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, so we're currently working on our main exhibit, so if you come before summer of 2021, you won't see the main exhibit, but you'll see this temporary exhibit we've just recently put in that we're standing in currently. And then throughout the year, we have different forms of programming. So we do that. That educational programming can be special events where we might have living history or kind of reenactors, people who do the research and reconstruct clothing or items that people would have used and then use them in that method to explain pieces of the story, or maybe lectures where we have experts who've done a lot of research come and present their findings here for the public. Research that we've done here on site that will turn into activities for people of all different age ranges to participate in this history. And then things like Facebook and Instagram, where we also present things that we've found that flesh out the story of Spanish Texas in particular, especially here at Mission Dolores.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today and for telling us more about the mission and all the amazing work that you guys are doing here today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming out. We appreciate having you.